Okay. Huh? Hey.
No, I
Hello?
can only start when the. Oh, right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the FCCT. My name is Tan Hui Yee. I am Bureau Chief of the Straits Times as well as board member of the club. We are here today to talk to Clare Hammond about her excellent book, held up here. On the shadow tracks, Journey Through Occupied Myanmar. There are copies of the book available for sale behind you. Clare is a British investigative journalist based in London. She works for the non-profit Global Witness. And her recent work has exposed failings by big tech and issues related to natural resources, conflict, and corruption. In Myanmar, where she lived for 6 years until 2020, she was most recently the digital editor of Frontier magazine. Now, this book, which I just recently finished, it's really great, is part travelogue, part commentary, part reportage, part investigation. It tells a story about Myanmar's colonial legacy and how the brutality of that initial British occupation has been woven into the fabric of life under the previous military regime. Now, what I loved most about the book was how she followed her curiosity literally to the end of some of the railway lines, which sometimes led to munitions factories, a military camp, or sometimes just in the middle of nowhere. She'll tell you more about that later. So this book lays out how the railway was not built to serve people, but to serve military interests. I recall when I was first learning about the ethnic groups in Myanmar, and someone was trying to explain to me how the spheres of influence are not contiguous. You know, you see a road built in these areas, and the road is controlled by the military, but areas off the road are controlled by these ethnic armed groups. And these infrastructures are always spaces of contest between the military as well as the ethnic armed groups. And that's something we see in the development of the railway network as well, as explained in Clare's book. So without further ado, I'm going to grill her about her book. And after I grill her, you can continue grilling her. All right? So if any time you think I'm taking too long, just raise your hand, and then I can start, I can open the floor to questions from you. Okay? You look very eager, so I'm sure there will be many questions tonight. Okay, so Clare. Myanmar's previous military junta built over 3,000 kilometers of railways. So how did it do this, and how does this method compare with the colonial British attempts to build railways?
Thank you so much. And first of all, hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. Yeah, as you said, Myanmar's railways are not your typical railways. And the military regime started building these lines in the 1990s. I'll do a bit of scene setting.
Go ahead.
At the time, there had been an uprising in 1988, and the military had managed to regain power towards the end of that year. But the uprisings had revealed how weak it was, what a weak position it was in. They'd toppled the government of the aging dictator Ne Win, who had basically tried to introduce something that he called socialism, but had bankrupted the country. And insurgencies had flourished in the borderlands. And the military generals under the State Law and Order Restoration Council, or SLORC, which would later become to be ruled by a general called Tan Hui, they realized that their main problem was one of... Oh, can you hear me? Here? Their main problem was one of access, particularly in Myanmar's far south. I'm sure most of you know, but for those of you who don't, Myanmar's kind of shaped like this, like a kite, and there's a long bit of land in the south that borders Thailand, and every year in the monsoon there were landslides, and the military physically couldn't get down there. The same was true in a lot of Shan State up in the east and up towards the Indian border. So they knew that they needed to build infrastructure to get access to these areas in order to crush the insurgencies. And around the same time, there were these massive military campaigns happening. But they were also bankrupt because of Ne Win's experiment with socialism. And so their solution was to go into villages in remote parts of the country and start rounding up civilians and forcing them to work. So the stories that I heard everywhere in Myanmar were very similar. This was obviously systematic, and it obviously came from the top because the similarities were too similar for it to have been otherwise. And soldiers would roll into a village, often a village that had never really had much experience of the Burmese state, where people didn't speak Burmese. A lot of these were ethnic minority areas. And they would call the village head to a meeting, and they'd say, we need one person from every household to come and help build a railway. And a lot of the people that I spoke to said they'd never seen a railway before in their lives. And obviously they had no interest in going. They had farms to attend to. Most people were subsistence farmers, as had been encouraged under the previous regime. But the soldiers who came into their villages were armed, and these were civilians, and they didn't really have much choice. So they would go and gather their own tools, machetes, tree-cutting saws, basic kind of tools that they used on their farms. They'd pack their own food, enough to last them for a few weeks, sometimes a month, maybe more. And they would be driven to, in army trucks, or they would walk to places in the jungle where they were told to start working. And they weren't given anything. They weren't given shelter. A lot of people said that they slept on the ground. In the initial days of the railway construction, it was really just clearing a path through the jungle. So you had these gangs of people who were totally unequipped to be doing this kind of work, and no machinery. It was all built by hand. And they'd just be sent out into the jungle and told to clear a path. Once that was done, then there were some more formal camps that were set up. People would build long houses. There was a lot of corruption. People would obviously pay to not go, if you could afford to not go. And then somebody else would be forced to go. And there was also a lot of child labor, because if you go to a family and you say someone from this family has to work on a railway and the family's income is from their farms, they're going to send one of the younger children off to go and do it. And there were lots of human rights abuses. You know, these railways weren't taking place in isolation. They were taking place specifically in tandem with these campaigns against ethnic armed groups in the borderlands, and the military was fighting pretty fierce wars at the same time. And because of the language barrier, for various other reasons, because of the historic conflicts, then a lot of civilian villagers and railway workers were often accused of supporting the resistance. They were interrogated, they were tortured. People who tried to escape from the camps were tortured or killed. So that was how railway building began in the military's Myanmar. There was obviously increasing international scrutiny about what was going on in the late 1990s, and when that came to an end, the practice of forced labour under intense international pressure, then a second phase of railway building began. This one started in the early 2000s, at a time when Myanmar's generals were starting to get really, really rich. And this period of railway building was characterised basically by corruption. So this book tells a story of a journey that I made following a map of the railway network, and the map shows that there are railways all over the country, but a lot of these projects were built in the 2000s and onwards, and I'd get there and there was very little railway left. Huge amounts were budgeted for these projects. I think the military spent more on railway building then than it did on health and education. definitely education, possibly similar to health. But they have pretty much nothing to show for it. I went to Lang Thaya, which is a township on the outskirts of Yangon, hoping to catch the train into the Delta, which had opened very recently, according to the state media reports. And in state media, these railways were always alive and well. No one knew that there was even a station in Lang Thaya, and we had to ask loads of times before we found it. And eventually we found it by wading through a field, and there was this dilapidated building with a guy squatting in it. And I think the railway had run for about 3 or 4 months. Nobody had taken it because you could do the same journey. There were buses every 15 minutes, and the railway took way longer than that. And the earthwork collapsed anyway. So that was the second phase.
Sounds like a treasure hunt just to find the railway stations.
Yeah, it was always like that on the newer lines. And I couldn't figure out what was going on at first because these were new railways, right? Mm-hmm. Do you want me to talk about the colonial?
Yeah, well, can you talk a bit about how there was a continuation of what happened under the colonial authorities?
Yeah, and this was the most fascinating part to me because I started out by looking at the military's railways, and then when I spent time in the archives in London and started piecing together the story of what the British had done in Myanmar, I realized, well then Burma, I realized that it was extremely similar. The environment in which the British first started building railways in the country was very similar to the environment in which the military later built railways. They were building them into contested territory with a view to occupying that territory. And after the Third Anglo-Burmese War, which was the final war, the British found themselves on paper in charge of this vast territory, the former Burmese kingdom and all of the different, what are now Myanmar's ethnic states in the highlands, but it had no means of getting around. It was jungle, narrow jungle paths and waterways. And after the war, there was this huge decentralized uprising everywhere in the country against British rule. It was a nationalist uprising. And Britain was at a military disadvantage because it didn't know the territory. It had hardly even been there. The empire was expanding so quickly that Britain hadn't really thought much about what it was going to do once it had won the war. And this was also the age of railway building was just beginning. And so pretty much as soon as the war ended, with no surveys, no debate about economic viability, the British just started building this railway straight through the centre of their new territory up to Mandalay and then up to Machina. And just like Myanmar's military did, it built the railways in sections and shuttled troops to an advancing front line as it did this. And at the same time, it cleared, British writing is quite euphemistic, perhaps the origin of clearance operations, but they were clearing the surrounding villages, massed forced relocation, very similar tactics to what the military was doing later on. And then they fortified this network with the infrastructure of colonial occupation, the sort of the barracks, the prisons, and so on, which is what Myanmar's military did all those years later. And then once they'd established control, there was a second phase. I'll just talk briefly a little bit about forced labour. We don't have much about the people who worked on the British railways. There doesn't seem to have been forced labour. I think it was more that people were rounded up and told to build a railway and paid very little. The conditions that they worked in were very similar to the people who worked on the military's railways much later. They worked by hand, difficult back-breaking work. They were farmers as well, so they had no experience railway building. And the jungles that they built through, I don't know if you've ever spent much time in the jungles of Myanmar, but they're pretty scary places to be for long periods of time. There's obviously lots of wildlife, snakes, spiders, and mosquito-borne diseases, particularly cerebral malaria. And you see in the British reports that they said that the jungles were more malarious and deadly than anywhere else, that people were building railways in the empire. So you can get a sense of people were likely to have died. The second phase of British railway building was quite similar in a way to the second phase of railway building in modern Myanmar. It wasn't as overtly corrupt, like the railways actually were built, but they were built for extraction, and they were built by companies, and the rationale was usually that they were built to connect a new mine or the teak or other hardwood forests to the dockyards at Rangoon, and then the British would cut down the trees, they'd mine the rubies and the tin and the tungsten and everything else, and enrich basically the company shareholders and people back in London at the expense of the Burmese whose land they were taking. So that's a kind of probably a bit too long summary of
it's fascinating. It's good to see the parallels. Let's bring it more to the present. Under the previous military junta, in the book you had talked about the various agendas at play in building the railway, right? What are the varied objectives that the generals had when they were building the railway network, or pretending to build the railway network in some places?
They did build quite a lot of railways, and I think from my conversations when I was looking into this, then most of the railway ministers that had served under Tan Hui had actually died by the time I got to researching this book. One railway minister was still alive and amazingly happy to talk. I'm not sure how candid he was, but that was a general called Ong Min, who was a minister in the president's office, and he was one of the kind of reformers during that period of liberalisation from 2010 to 2015 under the Thein Sein government. And we had quite a few long conversations in Yangon where he talked about how it was his task, really, and I think the difference between what the British did and what the military regime did is that the British were state building, whereas the regime were nation building. The British couldn't have cared less about building a nation. They just wanted to occupy the territory and extract the resources. But for Ong Min and Tan Hui and that whole regime, development regime, it was about creating what Ong Min described as a Myanmar identity, and he likened it to America. And he said, in America there's people from everywhere and they all call themselves American. We want to do the same thing in Myanmar. And he'd been given this task by the dictator Tan Hui to connect every state and region by rail. And I think other ministries were doing the same thing, because there was this massive expansion of infrastructure into the borderlands. The idea was that connectivity would mean that everyone began to share a national identity. The problem was that for the military, this vision had the military at its center. And if you go to Naypyidaw, you're left in no doubt about what their intentions were. It's a military city. The most luxurious fortified parts of the city are the military zone. And everybody else is basically kept under constant surveillance. So I think the brutal methods that the military used to try and bring the country together eventually had the opposite effect. The railways, particularly in the ethnic states, have become symbols of a Burmese occupation and another reason why they want independence from the Burmese state.
So there were a lot of human rights abuses in the construction of the railway. To what extent was the outside world aware of that?
A little bit. I think, particularly in the 1990s, reports of forced labour were starting to come across the border, probably a year or so after the military started building its railways. It was Myanmar was very, very closed at the time. You know, it's a very different place to what it is now. There were no mobile phone networks. Those were only rolled out in 2014. There was no internet. There was no way for stories to get out. And I think the fear of punishment meant that stories didn't really spread even, you know, within the country. And also the lack of accessibility, right? I've talked about how difficult it was to get into the borderlands because there was no infrastructure at the time. But stories started coming across the border with refugees about this systematic forced labor. The railways were just a part of the story. There was forced labor on everything. So people were being forced to build the military's barracks, people were being forced to build roads, people were being forced to build hydropower dams. Like, the entire miraculous development of the country was pretty much done through forced labor. And the testimonies were also about the brutality that attended the military's campaigns in the borderlands, and people being forced to be human shields, guides, porters. Porters basically meant that you had to carry all of the military's equipment in its campaigns against ethnic armed groups. So the story of the railways was kind of mixed up in all that. There was a lot of testimony from the southern railway line that was from Yei and Mon State to Dawei in Tanintharyi, because the border with Thailand was pretty porous and it was pretty easy for people to get out. There was some information about the railway in Kayah State. There were a lot of really bad human rights abuses associated with that. And again, Kayah borders Thailand, so it was relatively easy for people to get out. In the west of the country, it was much harder. And I think, you know, India's always been a much less easy place for refugees to be and to talk freely about what's happened to them. Bangladesh as well, and it was difficult for human rights documenters to get there. And then there were some railways in the center of the country where really there's very, very little testimony at all about what happened. And I was sort of trying to piece it together. But even when I was there and talking to people, it was pretty hard to get information. And, you know, and that was all those years later as well, of course.
Yeah, I can imagine, because I was reading it, and it's funny that you kind of show us bits and pieces of your discovery process. So it's us following the journey, the mystery of what happened to the railway in the book, which is the really great part of it.
Right. I mean, often I don't find the answers, right? It's a book about silence as much as anything.
Yeah, it's about what's missing and what's not been recorded. What is the current state of the railways? Maybe the floor can answer that. We've got many experts here.
Has anyone been recently?
Has anyone taken a railway in Myanmar recently? No? Taken a train? No. That says a lot.
I can talk about what it was like when I traveled on them.
Sure.
I think it's probably changed a lot, because a lot of the places where I traveled are now in contested territory. There's been a lot of attacks on the railway lines. That's always been the case throughout Myanmar's history, and particularly up in the north in Kachin State. But since the coup, there have been pretty regular attacks by PDFs and ethnic armed groups on railway lines across the country. And a lot of the railways are in territory that's now held by ethnic armed groups. I'm thinking particularly Rakhine and Shan State. So they're probably functioning even less well than they did when I was there. But I'd say there's broadly 3 categories of railway in various states of dysfunction and disrepair. So there's the central network, and that was built by the British. And that's basically functional. You can travel on the trains. Like, there are problems, you know, quirks of the Myanmar railway network. Like, you can only buy a ticket from the station you're traveling from in person on the day that the train's leaving. And you know, it's hard to figure out when the trains are running. You probably have to get up really early in the morning, because trains, it's a legacy of the country's conflicts that trains run in daylight hours as much as possible, so they start very early to make the most of the day. So
you've got to be very determined to take the train.
You've got to be determined, and it's like, it's bumpy and it's really slow, like 20 miles an hour, so it can take you days. If you want to go from Yangon in the south up to Machina in the north, it can take you a really, really long time. You know, the toilets are not great. It's like, but it's possible to do, and it's enjoyable, and lots of people do take those trains, and you have a beautiful view of the country and so on. The second category is probably the smaller British-built lines and the railways that the military built that are running. I'll give you an example of one journey that I took, was into the Delta. You have to really work hard to get a ticket. Like, I was trying to ask for a ticket and people kept saying, no, the train's not running, or no, you can't have a ticket because you should take the bus because the bus is much easier. But I insisted and insisted. Took one train, had to wait for about 6 hours for the next one, which was this tiny little rail car with rain streaming through the windows. It was in the late monsoon, crammed into the engine room with all kinds of other people and my head wedged out of the window. And then we, in the late afternoon, came to a stream and everyone got out and we had to get on these little motorized canoes over to the other side, and everyone's like carrying all of their luggage, big suitcases and so on. And then on the other side there's a train and all of the seats have been ripped out. So you have to walk through like several carriages to find a seat. And that train is not going anywhere. And it doesn't go anywhere for hours and hours. And finally it's fixed, but it's nighttime and there are no lights and you're traveling in total darkness. And I'd sort of been hoping to get a hotel at the other end, but we pulled into this tiny, tiny village, and obviously there was no hotel. It was on the bank of the Irrawaddy River, and I ended up having to spend the night on the floor of a tea shop. So that, I'd say that's kind of the second category of railway. And then the third category, I mostly went on the railway, but I was mostly traveling by motorbike or by foot, because they're just not running, or there'd be like a 20-kilometer section that's running and there'll be a train once every few days. The tracks are overgrown. You often sort of have to follow the track and get lost in the undergrowth. One guy called it the bush railway. I think that's a pretty good description of what it is. Yeah, so that was the state of the railways in 2016. I guess it would be relatively similar now, but with a lot less services running, probably.
In the book, you also talked about how you you followed the trail sometimes to a military camp or a munitions factory. Could you share a bit about that?
Yeah, in the, I'm not sure when it was. It would have been sometime after the 1988 uprisings. The military moved its weapons factories away from Yangon. It had seen itself as very vulnerable in Yangon, and it moved the weapons factories to the western bank of the Irrawaddy River, to Pie and to Magway and all of the places surrounding that, up into the mountains towards Chin State. And it built this railway line along the western bank of the river that connected the weapons factories. What I think they were doing was they were building this massive supply chain with Naypyidaw at its center. So all around the country, the railways would connect new military bases that were built. So the expansion of the railway network coincided with this massive expansion of the armed forces all over the country into the borderlands. And along the railway route, they'd build these barracks to kind of fortify the track. And then they'd have the weapons factories in the west of the country, and then also heavy industries. So I'd often start walking down a railway that seemed abandoned, and it would lead me to a rubber factory or a cement factory. These were run by the military's conglomerates, Myanmar Economic Corporation, MEHL. And the idea was, I suppose, railways are very well suited to moving heavy equipment, supplies, soldiers around the country. They could lean quite heavily on the state because soldiers travelled for free on Myanmar's railway networks, so it was like free logistics. Right. They sort of succeeded at this. The problem was that the military was so bad at building railways And so a lot of this supply chain, there were big gaps in it. They also used the roads. I mean,
Right.
in the 1990s, then the road network was expanded a lot as well. And yeah.
Great, thanks. At this point, I'm going to ask you, do you have any questions? Do you have any questions from the floor? If not, I'm going to continue my questions. Oh, we've got questions, okay.
Hi. Thanks, Claire, for a great, some great insights. And I'm Gwen Robinson from the FCCT. And I was wondering when did the book actually cut? I haven't read the whole thing yet, actually, but when did the book actually cut off? What was your last experience on the ground in Myanmar? And part two is, I notice, so things like the Japanese have spent a lot of money trying to upgrade certain lines. So, you know, they've been doing Yangon to Mandalay. And I think they've basically given up at Taungu or somewhere like that. But were you looking at some of these upgrade projects as well? Thanks.
Thanks so much, Gwen. The book cuts off, I mean, the epilogue is about what happened after the coup. I was in Myanmar until 2020 and left during COVID and couldn't get back in because there was some British strain of the coronavirus that was a convenient excuse to not let journalists back into the country. You needed permission from your line ministry, apparently. Anyway, the journey itself was done over a period of 3 months in 2016, and the book focuses very closely on that period. The last part of the book really is about what's happened to the railways since the coup, and it's something that I'd actually be really interested to hear from anyone here who might have some insights into this. But it seemed like I was fascinated from London to see reports start emerging in the new light of Myanmar again. Is it still the global new light? Yes. In the global new light again about railway building and Min Aung Hlaing going to tour railway stations and building a new line to Pimpet, I think, in Pao territory, which is connected to a Russian-backed steel factory. So I think railways are once again becoming part of the way the military is fighting the wars against its own people. I don't know whether that has come to anything or not. But yeah, it's pretty hard. I mean, it was hard enough to get information when I was actually there following these railway lines, so it's double hard from London. The Japanese upgrades I actually didn't focus on. I was sort of figuring out whether there was a way to get them into the story. The story is more about the construction of new lines and the sort of contested land and ways of thinking about the country and how it should be. The Japanese were upgrading a line that was built by the British and doing, I think, a pretty good job, which made it a little bit less interesting for me. But yeah, there was all these talk about high-speed trains and high-speed Yangon to Mandalay line. I'm not sure that ever happened. I did travel on it a few times in the years after I made this journey, and it never seemed to get very much more high-speed. And the circle line. I love the circle line. I did the circle line a lot, yeah.
Was that British built or Army built?
Bits of it were British built, yeah, actually to connect the British barracks and the insane prison.
Great, thank you.
The Circle Line was kind of one of the reasons I got so interested in Myanmar's railways in the first place, because it's so fun. It's so fun to ride.
How long does it take?
3 hours? Okay, 4.
It takes 3 hours to get around Yangon. Wow. Okay, great. Thank you. Can we have the second question, please?
Hello, I'm Lance Woodruff, and I'm a freelance writer and photographer. I first traveled on Myanmar railways in Burma in 1972. I'm a little older than some of the rest here. But I'm interested in your take on the condition of the very long wooden trestle bridges. I went from Machina to Mandalay about 10 years ago, and after going, I mean, I'd be very cautious about going on a train over those ancient bridges. Did you do any research, any feedback on that?
Thank you so much. Yeah, they're absolutely terrifying. And before I set out on the journey, my colleagues at the Myanmar Times took great pleasure in describing to me an accident that had happened when a bridge had collapsed. And it was actually that line from Mandalay to Machina that seems to have an awful lot of very, very fragile bridges. And I interviewed a train driver in Machina who was from a family of train drivers, and he was describing these horrific conditions that they'd been driving the trains in, with KIA soldiers in the jungle shooting at the trains. But actually the worst accident that he'd had, and he had scars all over his body, and he had photos, I think one of his colleagues had drowned, was when a bridge collapsed. Pretty much all of the money that went on Myanmar's railway network in the 2000s was on building new railways. 90%, I think, of the budget went on building new lines, and so that left very, very little for repairs. I'm also pretty worried about the Goktek viaduct and whether at some point that might just give in. Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
Yeah, my name is Steve Parker, and it's interesting you brought up Pinpet. It's actually a very minor steel mill there, but it was aimed to supply a steel mill in Minjin, in Mandalay region. That's the big steel mill that was built by the Chinese with Italian support,
Right.
a technical support. And there was meant to be a train line that would take the ore from Pinpet down to Minjin. But of course, the ore didn't really fit. It wasn't the right kind of ore. It was a bit of a pipe dream. It was over $1 billion that the Chinese financed, and the military kept that until the time they had to begin to pay for it. And when they had to begin to pay for it, they put it over to the government. And the government had to pay $100 million a year for a set of project that didn't work at all. And that train has not happened at all. And it didn't even really make sense, because the iron ore in Pinpet wasn't really the kind of iron ore and steel that needed to go down to the big steel mill. So it was just a bit of a pipe dream. And you know, also what you were talking about, in the agriculture department, they built a huge percentage of the agriculture department was into building dams. But they never, ever built linkages, irrigation linkages to farmers. Mm. They just built all these dams with all kind of money and all kinds of corruption. So both those cases were similar in you know, these kind of big schemes, but they didn't really lead anywhere. Yeah, but they left a lot of debt.
It's criminal, really, how much money was wasted. Thank you so much. That's really interesting.
Hi, I'm Ian. I did manage to get back into Myanmar before they imposed that law. And then there was the coup. And I remember, you know, being horrified seeing things like, you know, soldiers forcing passers-by to move, you know, barricades, like, you know, forced portering. But then realizing those were like British colonial laws that they were kind of using to do that. And you talk a bit in the book about, you know, how some of the, you know, the activities undertaken by the junta to build the railways were actually using British colonial laws. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that continuity between colonial laws and what the junta was doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was the Village Act and the Towns Act that were passed in 1905, 1906, and they provided for the use of forced labour. And then when Britain ratified the Forced Labour Convention, it didn't do it in British India, which then included Burma, so forced labour was still legal. And then in the 1990s, there was this long, long back and forth with the ILO, the International Labour Organization, about whether or not Myanmar would repeal these laws, and in the end, I don't think it ever did. There are obviously a lot of laws like that that still remain on Myanmar's books that were written by the British. It's a problem across much of the former empire, and it works very much to the advantage of men who are still ruling the country in much the same way.
Thank you. Can we have the next question, please?
Hi. So kind of a two-part. I also lived in Yangon at the same time as Claire did, although I left a couple of months after the coup started. And I lived right by the Yangon Central Station, by Tenpuse. And so we were there when they started to forcibly evict the CDMers, the railway workers who were refusing to go to work. And the military rocked up. You know, they cut the Wi-Fi off at 1 a.m. and the military rocked up, and we were sort of seeing, you know, people being herded from the houses, and there were police and military and people running around with, you know, metal rods, and we couldn't quite figure out what was happening at the moment. You know, we hadn't read your book, so we weren't really aware of what was going on. It was only when we started to recognise people in the neighbourhood that we realised which side we were on and who was doing, you know, better or worse. So I just think, you know, you really captured kind of the essence of Myanmar, and it was super. It was just really interesting to read. I'm halfway through. I need to get back to it, but the second part is just you were asking about what the railways are like at the moment. So our friend Wixie, running Carzo, one of Myanmar's major logistic operations, says that at the moment logistics are still a nightmare. Nothing different that you haven't heard or anything you've said, but just so you can hear it from him. He said the North has been pretty much taken over by the Northern Brotherhood Alliance and China. So he said basically at the moment, obviously, it's exactly as you said. So I guess that potentially is, I won't say the closest we're going to get to an expert, because obviously there are a lot of experts in the room tonight. But yeah, that's just from someone who has logistic operations in the country at the moment. Yeah,
great to hear from Wixie, and thank you for sharing that about what happened in Yangon after the coup. The amazing thing was that the Myanmar railway staff were at the forefront of the civil disobedience movement. After the medics, I think they were really leading it. 90% of them stopped working, and the backlash against that was so violent, it really underscored how important the railways were to the military and its operations. People had laid down on the tracks to prevent army supply trains from leaving, because army supply trains were leaving, you know, they were going all over the country immediately in the days after the coup. But the bravery of the railway workers was amazing, particularly because most people who work for the railways are part of railway families, and those are skills that are not that easily learned, and so to sort of step away from all of that and risk all of that was very, very brave.
Hello, I'm Peter Whitten. I was a journalist. I have been not necessarily very successful investor in Myanmar in recent years, for obvious reasons. On a positive note, there is investment in the railways. About 6 weeks ago, I was in Yangon, and I can assure you that on the Yangon Circular Railway at Tar Main Station, they are rebuilding the station buildings. Okay. I have only seen a few trains going by in recent months. So something is happening, and all that Japanese gravel or bedrock or whatever they call it is still there on the circular railway. Now I have one question. I haven't read your book, but I've obviously read the reviews and whatever. It sounds very interesting. But historically, remembering that Myanmar, Burma, was not a British colony, but a colony of British India, and that the Indian railways were run by the Anglo-Indians, it's a mixed race group. How far is there a legacy in any way, shape or form in Myanmar did you come across of railway workers, railway families who were actually Anglo-Indian?
You talked about.
There absolutely is, and also a legacy of railway workers who are Indian, particularly on the railways to the north, around Mandalay, the stations up to Machina, and the stations through Pyeonluin, which was then Maemyo, the summer capital of British Burma. A lot of the railway staff there that I spoke to, their fathers worked on the railways and their grandfathers worked on the railways, and they came across with the British because the British state in Burma, as you say, it was part of British India. And a lot of the people who were skilled in running the railways came over with the British and found jobs there. The British didn't really train up the Burmese to work on the railways or indeed anything else. And so the railways were run by Indians and inevitably Anglo-Indians as well. So that legacy still very much exists in Myanmar.
Thank you. Do we have another question? If not, I'm going to ask you a question.
Okay.
So, a lot of your journey involved you being like the only foreigner in the train carriage, very visible, and also an object of curiosity, right? Everybody following you on this journey. Could you tell us a bit about what motivated you to take this journey and continue with it, despite whatever you encountered?
Yeah, I'll just talk a bit about the origins of the book first. I was working as a journalist at the Myanmar Times. That's where I covered the election, but I was a financial journalist before I moved to Myanmar, and so I worked as the business editor at the Myanmar Times. And I was covering the election to a degree, but through a business lens, and I was reading a lot of the policy papers on infrastructure development and things like that at the time. So in 2016, after the election, I was sort of thinking about what was I going to do next. Was I going to move home? Thinking about potentially traveling around the country a little bit. And I remember it really well, sitting in the newsroom, and I was reading a report by the Asian Development Bank. They were doing a lot of the improvements to the railway network, as Gwen touched on. And they've been working with the Railway Ministry, and they've been digitizing a lot of its documents. A lot of the documents were on paper until this point. And this was happening across the ministries. There were advisors and development people coming in and sort of trying to sort things out a little bit. And on page 14 of this pretty dry policy report, there was a map. And that was the map of the railway network that I then ended up following around the country. And it showed the colonial railways, the backbone of the network. And that was pretty much the only railway network that I was aware of in Myanmar. And I'd been traveling around a bit. I'd been taking trains to Molamyain, to Bago, the Yangon Circle Line. So I was really surprised, because I thought I knew the country pretty well by then, or well enough that I would know if there were thousands and thousands of kilometers of railways to all different parts of the country. Then I started asking questions about them, and no one really knew about them. So I was pretty fascinated by this. And for some reason, I'm not exactly sure what I thought I was going to find, but I suspected there might be a story there to tell. Packed a backpack and set out to figure out why they were built. And I was definitely a curiosity. The railway department have their own police force, and ever since the colonial period, a large part of the job of the railway police officers is to basically spy on the population. Because right up until the 1990s, when the roads were improved, then pretty much all long-distance travel in Myanmar was by train. And so that's where people were, and that's where people talked over long, long periods, because trains would often break down. And so you'd have the railway police and plainclothes officers just sitting in the carriage and taking notes. And when they saw me, particularly on some of the more remote lines, I ended up, a pretty permanent feature of my journey was that I'd have 1 or 2 police escorts who wanted to know what I was doing, who wanted a lot of details about me. I was just saying earlier, they always asked for my marital status, which was a pretty weird question. And then they'd write a report. And then the problem was that these reports probably, I suspect, weren't centralized. And so I'd get into another part of the country and somebody else would have to come and ask all of the same questions again. Everyone was always very polite. I think it's important to remember that this was a very different time. It was just after the election. Aung San Suu Kyi was in government, and there were lots of tourists in the country, and so parts of the railways I wasn't that conspicuous. In the borderlands, more so, and particularly because I was asking strange questions about the railways and why they were built, and this didn't really seem to them to be like a legitimate reason to be there. But on the other hand, I think me being a lone female traveller worked in my favour, because particularly the women that I travelled with would immediately befriend me and come and sit with me and share their food, show me photographs, because everyone suddenly had Facebook, so photographs of their entire families, aunts, children, and entertain me over what for 3 months ended up being an awful lot of long railway journeys.
How did they entertain you?
Talking,
Oh, okay.
sharing their food,
All right.
singing, you know.
Sounds fun.
Yeah, everyone was pretty happy to make friends.
Okay. What was the most memorable part of the journey?
I think it probably has to be my visit to the Bordwin mines, which are up in northern Shan State. Originally the Chinese had mined silver there, and then the British developed them into some of the biggest zinc, lead, silver mines in the world. And when I was traveling, that part of the country had been closed to foreign visitors since the 1960s. But I found out from a tour agent friend in Yangon that it was possible to go there. You just had to get a permit, and you would have a chaperone, and you also had to hire your own train. The railway had shut because the mines were not running at the time. But ever since the 90s, and possibly before that, groups of European, British railway enthusiasts, I don't know if the same thing exists in Asia, but anyway, it's a big thing in the UK. They love railways, they love old railways, they love steam trains in particular, and Myanmar had functioning steam trains until quite recently. And so they'd convinced the military regime, I think it became a kind of side hustle for the generals, that they'd accept thousands of dollars and let these old Europeans commission steam trains. So I sort of pretended that I was a railway enthusiast, and I think the guy... I am a railway enthusiast. The guy who was running the tour agency in Yangon kind of took pity on me and figured out that it was possible to hire a very small diesel-run trolley, rail car, for a fraction of the price.
How much was it?
It was a few $100s.
Okay.
$900.
Right.
And so I went up there, and my guides picked me up from Sipor, which is on the mainline railway, and drove me down to Namtu, which was this area that had been pretty conflict-torn for a long time. And we took this little tiny railway all the way on this old mining line. Part of the tour was places where you could photograph the railway track itself, because it was a tour for railway enthusiasts. So we had to get on and off a lot and take photos of what was like a 540-degree spiral. But it took us, it's a railway thing.
Right, right. I don't know what that means.
No, it's like it goes all the way round. And if you love railways, then it's a really big deal because they're quite rare in the world. And because I pretended that I loved railways, then I had to sort of play along. Yeah.
Okay.
But then the mines themselves were basically as the British had left them. It was this incredible isolated community that had only been connected to the outside world by a road a couple of years before. There was the same old school, the same old hospital where people talked about how it had been bombed in the war by the Japanese and by the British, because the British tried to destroy everything the Japanese had occupied. And there was this one tiny television set at the local restaurant, and we were eating there, me and my guide, who was an extraordinary character called Ronnie, who had one leg but was still a table tennis champion in the Southeast Asian Games and had his own band called the Ronnie Club Band. He was sitting there eating his lunch with me and Sai, our driver, and then this news broke out on the state broadcaster that conflict had broken out all across the state and around Bordwin and Namtu, where we were staying, and we had no internet signal. And the two men I was with obviously had family in the places where this was happening and were panicking, because even in the 2 years, people had come to rely on Facebook as a source of news. And so we had this frantic return all along the spiral and back and through the hills back to Namtu, stopping at an even more isolated settlement called Tiger Camp, which only had a few people left living there, but they had no way of accessing news, to kind of get out of the rail car, go up there, tell them what was happening, climb back in, rush back to the town. Wow. And I was pretty quickly whisked out of there because I had permission to be there from the civilian-run tourism ministry, but there were military intelligence people waiting at the place I was staying, and that didn't really count for anything with them, so I was whisked out the following day. So that was a pretty extraordinary part of the trip.
Great, wow, fascinating. So my last questions before we round up today's talk, given the railway's legacy, do you think it can ever be rehabilitated to serve civilians, to serve the people?
I think so. I think one of the most striking things after the coup was, as I've already touched on, people were lying down on the railway tracks to prevent trains from leaving, and there was a very strong sense that the railways and all parts of the state belonged to the people, not to the military. Mm-hmm. There was a very powerful poem written by one of Myanmar's most famous poets called Pandora, which she very kindly gave me permission to reproduce in the book, and the final line is, "They are our trains." It's in there, yeah. I think because of the state of a lot of the lines that were built, and the fact that a lot of the stations were not built near the villages because they were built near the barracks, it would be a huge expense to build that up and make it functioning. And I think whether a civilian-run Myanmar wants a lot of new railways sort of depends on the type of Myanmar that people want to build, because railways, particularly now, to build really good ones, they're very, very expensive. Mm-hmm. And they're quite well suited to states that have a powerful and wealthy central authority. That's why China's the world's foremost railway building power at the moment, and why Britain was. They tend to make power structures less balanced. They tend to sort of enrich the people who are already rich. Roads are much more democratic. They can be used by everybody. So yeah, I think that's one element of it. But I think in terms of the central lines, the railways that already exist, yeah, there's definitely a place for them in civilian-run Myanmar, and it's fun to ride the trains.
On that note, please join me in thanking Claire for this very fascinating discussion.
Thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you for fantastic questions, and thank you all for fantastic questions as well.
I have been tasked to get an autograph from you by the owner of the book.
Who is the owner of the book?